The blood on Isabella Parrish's feet left crimson trails across the pristine Colorado snow, each footprint a desperate marker of her flight from the burning wagon behind her. She stumbled forward through the mountain pass, her thin cotton dress offering no protection against the January wind that howled through the pines like a vengeful spirit. The year was 1877, and Grace Oliverson had been traveling with a merchant wagon train from Denver to the mining towns in the high country when everything had gone horribly wrong. The bandits had come at dawn, their guns blazing, their intentions clear. Grace had jumped from the wagon while it was still moving, hitting the frozen ground hard enough to lose both boots in the deep snow. She had run then, run until her lungs burned and her feet went numb, run until the sounds of gunfire and screaming faded behind her into the vast wilderness. Now she walked because she could no longer run. The cold had moved beyond pain into something worse, a creeping numbness that made her stumble over roots and rocks she could no longer feel beneath her. Her dark blonde hair, once pinned carefully beneath a modest bonnet, now hung loose and wild around her shoulders, tangled with pine needles and ice. At 22 years old, Grace had survived the death of her parents, the long journey west, and 3 years of hard work as a seamstress in Denver. She had not survived all that only to die alone in these mountains, but death seemed very close now, closer with each labored breath that turned to white mist in the frozen air. The sky above was a hard, brittle blue, beautiful and merciless. Grace wrapped her arms around herself and kept walking because stopping meant dying, and she was not ready to die. Not yet. Not like this. She did not hear him approach. The snow-muffled sound and her own harsh breathing filled her ears. She only knew she was not alone when a massive hand gripped her shoulder, and she screamed, wheeling around with the last of her strength to fight whatever new threat had found her. Isaiah Parrish stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy bearskin coat, his weathered face framed by dark brown hair that fell past his collar. His eyes, a startling gray-blue like winter ice, widened as he took in the sight before him. The woman was half frozen, her lips pale, her feet bleeding onto the snow, her green eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. "Easy," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. "I am not going to hurt you." Grace wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the concern she saw in those strange, pale eyes, but trust had nearly killed her this morning. She tried to step back and her legs gave out entirely. Isaiah caught her before she hit the ground, his strong arms closing around her with surprising gentleness for a man his size. "Your feet," he said, and there was anger in his voice now, though Grace sensed it was not directed at her. "What happened?" "Bandits," she managed through chattering teeth. "The wagon train, they came at dawn. I ran." Isaiah looked back the way she had come, his jaw tightening beneath his thick beard. Smoke rose in the distance, a dark smudge against the bright sky. He had heard the gunshots earlier, from his cabin 3 miles up the mountain, but by the time he had gathered his rifle and made his way down, the sounds had stopped. Now he understood what had happened. Wagon trains were easy targets in these narrow passes, and there were men cruel enough to prey on travelers in this harsh country. He looked down at the woman in his arms. She was shivering violently now, her teeth chattering so hard he feared she might bite her tongue. Decision made, Isaiah set his rifle down carefully against a tree and bent to pull off his boots. They were heavy leather, lined with rabbit fur and worn to perfect comfort over years of use. "What are you doing?" Grace asked, confused. "Giving you my boots," Isaiah said simply. "Your feet are cut to pieces and half frozen. You will lose them entirely if we do not warm them soon. But you cannot walk barefoot. Grace protested weakly. Isaiah's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile beneath his beard. I have been walking these mountains since I was 15 years old. My feet are as tough as boot leather themselves. Yours are not. Before Grace could argue further, he had pulled both boots off and was kneeling in the snow beside her. His hands were huge and scarred, the hands of a man who worked hard and lived harder, but they were gentle as they lifted her feet one at a time and slid them into his still warm boots. The difference was immediate and overwhelming. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes as sensation began returning to her frozen toes, the warmth of the fur lining like heaven against her battered skin. "Thank you," she whispered. Isaiah tied the laces snugly, then stood and scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. Grace gasped at the sudden movement, instinctively gripping his coat for balance. This close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the solid strength of his chest beneath the heavy fur. "My cabin is 2 miles north," he said, retrieving his rifle with one hand while holding her securely with the other arm. "We need to get you inside and warmed properly before the cold does permanent damage." "I can walk," Grace said, though they both knew it was a lie. "Save your strength," Isaiah replied, and started walking. The 2 miles were the longest of Grace's life, though not because of discomfort. Isaiah carried her steadily through the snow, his bare feet seeming not to notice the cold and ice that would have crippled her within minutes. She watched his face as he walked, noting the hard lines of concentration, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for threats. His beard was full and dark with threads of gray, though she guessed him to be no more than 30 years old. The gray came from hard living, not age. "What is your name?" she asked after a long silence broken only by the crunch of his feet in the snow and the whisper of wind through the pines. "Isaiah Parrish," he said. "I am Grace Oliverson." He nodded once, acknowledging the introduction, but did not slow his steady pace. Grace let her head rest against his shoulder, exhaustion overwhelming her now that immediate danger had passed. The warmth of his body and the rhythmic sway of his walking lulled her toward sleep, despite the cold. She fought it, knowing that sleep in this cold might mean never waking, but her eyes grew heavy. "Stay awake, Grace," Isaiah said, his voice cutting through the fog in her mind. "Talk to me. Tell me about Denver." So Grace talked, her words slurring together sometimes, about her work as a seamstress, about the little room she rented above a bakery, about the smell of fresh bread every morning. She talked about saving enough money to buy fabric for a new dress, about the church social where she met the merchant who offered her work as a cook and mender for his wagon train traveling to the mining camps. She talked about anything and everything to stay awake, and Isaiah listened, occasionally asking questions to keep her talking. The cabin appeared suddenly, tucked into a clearing where the pines grew thick and protective. It was larger than Grace expected, built solidly of logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney from which no smoke currently rose. A lean-to shelter against one side housed a large bay horse that whinnied at their approach. Isaiah carried Grace directly to the door, kicked it open with one foot, and brought her inside. The interior was dim and cold, but Grace could see it was well kept. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a bed with a thick quilt in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies and tools. Animal furs covered parts of the floor, and more hung on the walls, likely drying and being processed. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something else, something wild that Grace could not quite identify. Isaiah set her down in one of the chairs near the fireplace, then moved with efficient speed to build a fire. Within minutes, flames crackled and danced, heat beginning to fill the small space. He hung a kettle of water over the flames, then turned his attention back to Grace. "We need to check your feet properly," he said, kneeling before her again. "This may hurt." Grace nodded, bracing herself. Isaiah carefully unlaced the boots and removed them, his face darkening as he examined her feet in the growing firelight. The soles were cut in multiple places, some cuts deep, all of them dirty with frozen blood and debris. Her toes were pale, some showing the white patches of frostbite. "You were very close to losing them," Isaiah said quietly. He stood and moved to one of his shelves, returning with clean cloth, a bottle of whiskey and a tin of what looked like salve. "This will hurt," he warned again. The whiskey burned like liquid fire when he poured it over her cuts, and Grace bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out. Isaiah worked quickly but thoroughly, cleaning each wound, applying the salve, and wrapping her feet in clean strips of cloth. His hands remained gentle throughout, though Grace could see the tension in his shoulders, the muscle jumping in his jaw. When he finished, he looked up at her. "You were lucky I found you when I did," he said. "I know," Grace replied. "Thank you for everything." Isaiah stood and moved back to the fire, adding more wood, checking the water. "You said there were bandits. Did you see how many? 5, maybe 6. They came fast. Everything happened so quickly." Grace's voice shook with the memory. "There was shooting, people screaming. I jumped from the wagon and ran. I do not know what happened to the others. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, I will go down and see what can be found," Isaiah said. "Tonight, you need rest and warmth." He poured hot water into a cup, added something from a pouch that smelled of herbs and honey, and handed it to Grace. She sipped it gratefully, the warmth spreading through her chest and belly, easing some of the bone-deep chill. Isaiah moved around the cabin with economical efficiency, checking his supplies, preparing a simple meal of venison stew from a pot that had been hanging in the cold, reheating it over the fire. Grace watched him work, noting the controlled power in every movement. He was massive, his shoulders straining the seams of his shirt when he shrugged out of his coat, his arms corded with muscle built from years of hard mountain living. His hands could probably snap a man's neck without effort, yet they had been nothing but gentle with her. It was a contradiction that fascinated her. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. 15 years, Isaiah replied, stirring the stew. "Since I was 18. Came west from Missouri, worked as a trapper and guide, eventually claimed this land and built the cabin 8 years ago." "Do you not get lonely?" Isaiah was quiet for a moment, his back to her. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But the mountains are good company. They do not lie or betray. They do not change who they are depending on who is watching. You know where you stand with the mountains." There was a story there, Grace sensed. Some pain or betrayal that had driven this man to choose solitude over society. But she was too tired to probe, and it was not her place to ask. Instead, she accepted the bowl of stew he handed her and ate slowly, each bite bringing more strength back to her exhausted body. Night fell quickly in the mountains, darkness pressing against the cabin's single window like something alive. The fire pushed it back, filling the space with warm orange light and dancing shadows. Isaiah spread additional furs on the floor near the fire and gestured to them. "You take the bed," he said. "I will sleep here tonight." "This is your home," Grace protested. "I cannot take your bed." "You are injured and still recovering from exposure," Isaiah said firmly. "You need the bed more than I do. This is not a discussion, Grace." The way he said her name in that deep, rumbling voice sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. Grace found herself blushing and was grateful for the dim light. She stood carefully, testing her wrapped feet, and made her way to the bed. It was simple but comfortable, the quilt heavy and warm. She lay down fully clothed, too modest and too unsure of the situation to do otherwise. "Isaiah," she said into the darkness. "Yes, why did you help me? You do not know me, I could be anyone." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire. When Isaiah finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Because I could," he said simply. "Because you needed help and I was there to give it. The mountains teach you that survival sometimes depends on the kindness of strangers. I have been that stranger needing help before. Today, I was the one who could offer it." Grace thought about that as sleep finally claimed her, dragging her down into darkness despite her efforts to stay awake and process everything that had happened. Her last conscious thought was that Isaiah Parrish might be the most decent man she had ever met, and it seemed impossible that he lived alone in the wilderness by choice. Morning came gray and cold, weak sunlight filtering through the window to wake Grace from dreams of gunfire and blood. She sat up quickly, disoriented before remembering where she was. The fire still burned, kept alive through the night, and Isaiah was nowhere to be seen. Grace's heart jumped with sudden fear until the door opened and he entered, bringing a gust of cold air and the smell of snow with him. "You are awake," he said, stamping his feet. He had found another pair of boots, older and more worn than the ones Grace still wore. "How do you feel?" "Sore," Grace admitted. "But alive, thanks to you. Where did you go?" "To check on my horse and the weather. There is another storm coming, probably by tonight. If I am going to investigate what happened to your wagon train, I need to go now." Fear clutched at Grace's chest. "You are leaving." Isaiah must have heard something in her voice because his expression softened slightly. "Only for a few hours. I need to see if there are survivors, if anyone needs help. The bandits are likely long gone by now." "I want to come with you." "Your feet." "Are your feet," Grace interrupted, "in your boots, wrapped in your bandages, and those are my people down there, or they were. I need to know what happened, please." Isaiah studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you can walk to the door without limping badly, you can come, but you follow my instructions exactly. If I tell you to hide, you hide. If I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" "Understood." Grace stood and walked carefully to the door. Her feet hurt, sharp pains shooting up her legs with each step, but she kept her face neutral and her stride as even as possible. Isaiah watched with narrowed eyes, clearly not fooled, but he did not argue further. "Eat first," he said, handing her dried meat and hard bread. "And drink. We leave in 10 minutes." The ride down the mountain was nothing like Grace expected. Isaiah saddled his bay horse, a massive gelding named Thor who stood patiently while his master worked. Then, to Grace's surprise, Isaiah swung into the saddle and reached down to pull her up behind him. She had no choice but to wrap her arms around his waist, pressing close against his back for balance and warmth. They moved slowly through the snow, Isaiah guiding Thor with practiced ease along paths invisible to Grace's eye. The muscles in his back shifted beneath her hands with each movement, and Grace found herself acutely aware of his size and strength, of the way he seemed completely at ease in this frozen wilderness that had nearly killed her yesterday. The sight of the massacre was worse than Grace had imagined. 3 wagons sat abandoned, one still smoking from yesterday's fire. Bodies lay in the snow, already partially covered by last night's light snowfall. Isaiah dismounted and helped Grace down, his face grim. "Stay with Thor," he ordered. "I will check for survivors." Grace wanted to argue, but the sight of the bodies froze the words in her throat. Instead, she nodded and held Thor's reins while Isaiah moved among the carnage with his rifle ready. He checked each body, his movements efficient but respectful. Grace recognized the merchant who had hired her, lying face down in the snow. the young couple who had been traveling to join family in the mining camps, the old man who had told stories by the campfire. "Grace," Isaiah called, and something in his tone made her heart leap. "Over here, quickly." She hurried as fast as her feet would allow to where Isaiah knelt beside a wagon. A woman lay there, breathing shallowly, her face pale and blood staining her dress. Grace recognized her as Martha Chen, another passenger, older than Grace by perhaps 10 years. "Martha," Grace said, kneeling beside her despite the pain. "Can you hear me?" Martha's eyes fluttered open. "Grace, you survived." "Yes, thanks to Isaiah. What happened after I ran? They took everything," Martha whispered. "The money, the supplies, the horses. They shot anyone who resisted. I played dead. They left me for dead." She coughed, blood flecking her lips. "Cold, so cold." Isaiah was already lifting her carefully. "We need to get her to the cabin. She cannot survive another night out here." The return trip was harder, with Isaiah riding and holding Martha while Grace sat behind, helping to support the injured woman. Martha drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing growing more labored. By the time they reached the cabin, Grace feared they were too late. But Isaiah worked with calm determination, laying Martha near the fire, checking her wounds, doing what he could with his limited supplies. The bullet had passed through her side, missing vital organs but causing significant blood loss. He cleaned and dressed the wound while Grace held Martha's hand and spoke soothingly to her. For 3 days, the storm Isaiah had predicted raged outside, trapping them in the cabin. For 3 days, Martha fought for life while Grace tended her, and Isaiah kept them all alive, hunting during brief breaks in the weather, maintaining the fire, melting snow for water. The close quarters forced an intimacy between Grace and Isaiah that might have taken months to develop otherwise. Grace learned that Isaiah had left Missouri after his father died, seeking a new life away from a stepmother who made it clear he was no longer welcome. He learned the mountains from a Ute trapper named Running Elk, worked as a scout for various expeditions, and eventually settled here in the high country where the solitude suited him. Isaiah learned that Grace was the only child of schoolteachers who had died of cholera during the crossing west. She had been 16 then, left alone in Denver with nothing but her sewing skills to support herself. She had worked hard, saved carefully, dreamed of eventually opening her own dress shop. The job with the wagon train was supposed to fund that dream. They talked late into the nights, keeping watch over Martha, sharing stories and silence in equal measure. Grace found herself watching Isaiah's face in the firelight, noting the way his eyes crinkled when he almost smiled, the gentleness in his rough hands when he checked Martha's bandages. He was unlike any man she had known in Denver, where men measured their worth in gold dust and social standing. Isaiah measured his in different ways: in survival, in self-sufficiency, in the strength to live according to his own terms. On the 4th day, Martha woke with clear eyes and asked for food. The crisis had passed. She would live, though recovery would be long. That evening, while Martha slept peacefully for the first time, Grace stepped outside to breathe fresh air and found Isaiah standing in the clearing, looking up at the stars that blazed overhead in the clean, cold air. "She will be all right," Grace said, moving to stand beside him. "Thanks to you," Isaiah replied. "You knew what she needed, how to care for her. I know wounds, but you know people." "We made a good team," Grace said softly. Isaiah was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he agreed. "We did." Something in his tone made Grace look up at him. He was already watching her, those pale eyes reflecting starlight. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and growing feelings neither quite knew how to name. Then Isaiah cleared his throat and looked away. "The weather should hold for a few days now," he said. When Martha is strong enough to travel, I will take you both down to Georgetown. It is the nearest town with a doctor and decent folk who can help you." Grace felt a sharp pang at his words, though she could not say exactly why. Of course he would take them to town. What did she expect? That she would live here forever in his cabin. That was absurd. And yet the thought of leaving, of never seeing him again, felt wrong in a way she did not want to examine too closely. "When do you think that will be?" she asked instead. "A week, maybe 2 if we are cautious." She needs strength before making that trip. A week or 2. Such a short time, and yet it suddenly felt precious to Grace, each day a gift to be savored rather than hurried through. She told herself it was because she was grateful to him, because he had saved her life and shown her kindness. But late at night, lying in his bed while he slept by the fire, she admitted the truth to herself. She was falling in love with Isaiah Parrish, this mountain man who had given her his boots and carried her through the snow, who lived alone but was not lonely, who was strong enough to survive the wilderness but gentle enough to nurse a dying woman back to health. It was foolish. They barely knew each other. They came from different worlds, and yet her heart did not care about logic or sense. Her heart only knew that waking each morning to find Isaiah already up and tending the fire made her feel safe and cared for in ways she had not felt since her parents died. Her heart knew that the sound of his deep voice saying her name sent warmth through her entire body. Her heart knew that when he looked at her, really looked at her with those startling pale eyes, she felt seen in a way she never had before. The days passed with surprising speed, falling into a comfortable rhythm. Isaiah would wake early, build up the fire, and often return with fresh game for breakfast. Grace would tend to Martha, prepare meals, and mend Isaiah's clothes, which were rough and patched but clean. They would talk while they worked, sharing more of themselves, growing comfortable with silence when words were not needed. Martha healed quickly, the resilience of a woman who had crossed half a continent showing through. She watched Grace and Isaiah with knowing eyes, saying nothing but missing nothing. One afternoon, while Isaiah was outside tending to Thor, Martha spoke. "He is a good man," she said to Grace. Grace looked up from the shirt she was mending. "Yes, he is, and you care for him." It was not a question, but Grace answered anyway. "Is it that obvious?" Martha smiled. "Only to someone who is looking, and I have had plenty of time to look while lying here. The question is, does he feel the same?" "I do not know," Grace admitted. "Sometimes I think. But then he talks about taking us to Georgetown, and I think I am imagining things." "Have you asked him what he wants?" "It is not that simple." "It never is," Martha said gently. "But Grace, you survived an attack, nearly froze to death, and ended up here against all odds. Maybe the universe is trying to tell you something. Maybe you should listen." That evening, as Grace helped Isaiah prepare dinner, she worked up the courage to speak. "Isaiah, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you live up here alone, really?" Isaiah's hand stilled on the venison he was cutting. For a long moment, Grace thought he would not answer. Then he set down his knife and turned to face her. "Because I am not good with people," he said simply. "I never have been. I am too big, too rough, too direct. In towns, people look at me and see a brute, someone to be wary of. Women especially. They see the size and the beard and the scars, and they cross the street to avoid me. Up here, none of that matters. The mountains do not care what I look like or how I talk. They judge me on what I can do, how well I survive. It is simpler." Grace's heart ached at the loneliness buried in his words, the old hurt he tried to hide. She took a step closer, looking up at him. "I do not see a brute when I look at you," she said quietly. Isaiah's eyes met hers, searching. "What do you see?" "A man who gave a stranger his boots and carried her to safety. A man who nurses sick women and keeps watch through the night to make sure they keep breathing. A man who is strong enough to survive alone but kind enough not to want others to suffer. She paused, then continued even softer. I see a man I could love if he would let me. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Grace's heart hammered in her chest, fear and hope warring inside her. Isaiah stared at her, something shifting behind his eyes, his expression unreadable. "Grace," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "You do not know what you are saying. You are grateful, that is all. When you get back to civilization, back to your normal life, you will realize that." "Do not tell me what I feel," Grace said, anger flashing through her. "I am 22 years old, Isaiah, not a child. I know the difference between gratitude and love. Do you know what I think? I think you are afraid." "Of course I am afraid," Isaiah said, his voice rising. "Look at me, Grace. Look at this life. What can I offer you? A cabin in the wilderness. Isolation from everything you know. Winters so harsh you cannot leave for months. Dangers around every corner. You deserve better than that. You deserve a real home, a real life, not to be trapped up here with me." "Maybe I want to be trapped up here with you," Grace said. "Did you ever think of that? Maybe I am tired of being alone in that city, surrounded by people but never really connecting with anyone. Maybe I have felt more alive, more myself, in these past weeks than I have in years. Maybe when I think about going back to Denver, back to my little room and my sewing, all I feel is empty." "You do not mean that." "Yes, I do." Grace closed the distance between them, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. "I know this is fast, I know it is crazy. But Isaiah, I am falling in love with you. Maybe I already have fallen. And I think if you are honest with yourself, you feel the same way." Isaiah looked down at her hand on his chest, then back up to her face. The walls he kept around himself were crumbling. She could see it happening, could see the loneliness and longing breaking through. "I do," he said hoarsely. "God help me, I do. From the moment I saw you in the snow, something shifted in me. Having you here, talking to you, learning who you are. Grace, you make this cabin feel like a home for the first time since I built it. But that does not mean it is right. That does not mean I should ask you to give up everything for me." "You are not asking," Grace said. "I am offering. There is a difference." Before Isaiah could respond, Martha coughed pointedly from her corner of the cabin. "For what it is worth," she said, "I think you would be fools to let each other go. But what do I know? I am just a woman who almost died and has nothing better to do than watch you two dance around each other." Despite everything, Grace laughed, and after a moment Isaiah did too, the sound rusty but genuine. The tension broke and he reached up to cover Grace's hand with his own, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "You are sure?" he asked quietly. "This is what you truly want?" "I am sure," Grace said. "Are you?" For answer, Isaiah bent his head and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, as though he feared she might break. But Grace pressed closer, her free hand coming up to tangle in his long hair, and the kiss deepened. There was passion there, yes, but also tenderness, promise, and hope. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I have wanted to do that for days," Isaiah admitted. "So have I," Grace said, smiling up at him. They told Martha the truth over dinner, that they wanted to try building a life together here in the mountains. Martha, for her part, seemed delighted though not particularly surprised. She had known, she said, from the way they looked at each other, the way they moved around the cabin in unconscious harmony, like two pieces of a puzzle fitting together. "What will you do?" Grace asked her. "When you are well enough to travel?" "I have a sister in Georgetown," Martha said. "That is where I was headed originally. I will go to her, start over. But I hope you will visit sometimes. It is not so far, and I would like to know how this story ends." "Deal," Isaiah said, and the women smiled at each other in understanding. The week that followed was perhaps the happiest of Grace's life. She and Isaiah talked for hours about practical matters, about how they would manage, what she would need, how they would prepare for the future. Isaiah showed her how to set snares for rabbits, how to read the weather in the clouds and the way the wind moved through the trees. Grace taught him the comfort of small domestic pleasures, the joy of clean, mended clothes and meals that were more than just fuel for survival. They learned each other in the ways that mattered. Grace learned that Isaiah woke before dawn every morning, that he was ticklish right below his ribs, that he sang off key while working and did not know he was doing it. Isaiah learned that Grace hummed when she concentrated, that she had a sharp sense of humor hidden beneath her modest exterior, that she was braver than she knew and stronger than she looked. And they kissed, often, the physical affection growing between them with natural ease. Isaiah was always careful, always aware of his strength and size, but Grace loved the way he held her, the way his large hands could be so gentle, the way he looked at her like she was something precious and rare. 2 weeks after the attack, Martha declared herself well enough to travel. Isaiah prepared Thor for the journey, packing supplies for the trip down to Georgetown. Grace felt a pang of anxiety at the thought of leaving the cabin, even temporarily, but she pushed it aside. This was necessary, and besides, she would be coming back. She was sure of it. The trip took most of a day, moving slowly for Martha's sake. They passed other cabins scattered through the mountains, and Isaiah greeted their occupants with reserved nods, introducing Grace as his intended. The word spread quickly, Grace could tell, and by the time they reached Georgetown as the sun was setting, she suspected half the town would know by morning. Georgetown was a mining town clinging to the mountainside, its main street lined with saloons, shops, and boarding houses. Isaiah took them straight to the home of Dr. Hendricks, an older man who examined Martha thoroughly and declared Isaiah's field medicine to have been excellent. "She will be fine," the doctor said. "Just needs rest and good food. You have a sister in town, Martha?" "Yes, Elizabeth Chen. She runs the boarding house on Main Street." "I know her. I will send word you are here." He turned to Isaiah. "And this must be the young lady I have been hearing about, Isaiah Parrish taking a wife. I never thought I would see the day." "We are not married yet," Isaiah said, his ears reddening. "Yet," Dr. Hendricks repeated with a knowing smile. "Well, when you are ready, Reverend Thomas would be happy to help with that. Good man, fair prices. Now, you two need a place to stay tonight." They ended up at Martha's sister's boarding house in separate rooms to maintain propriety. Grace lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling strange and displaced in this regular bed with its regular sheets in this regular town. She missed the cabin already, missed the sound of the wind through the pines and the crackle of the fire. Missed Isaiah, even though he was just down the hall. In the morning, Isaiah took Grace to the general store and told her to buy whatever she needed. Warmer clothes, practical supplies, anything she wanted. Grace was careful with his money, but she did buy sturdy dresses, wool stockings, boots that fit her properly, and fabric to make more clothes as needed. The storekeeper's wife helped her pick out items, chattering cheerfully about how romantic it was, the mountain man and the girl he saved. "You are lucky," the woman said. "Isaiah Parrish is known as a hard man but a fair one. He brought in a man once who had gotten lost in a blizzard, carried him 20 miles to town. Nearly died himself doing it. He does not talk much, but he is good people." Grace felt a surge of pride hearing someone else recognize what she already knew. Isaiah was good people, the best she had ever known. They visited Martha at her sister's house before leaving, and the older woman hugged Grace tightly. "Be happy," she whispered. "You have earned it." "So have you," Grace replied. "Thank you for everything." The ride back up the mountain felt like coming home. Isaiah sat close behind Grace this time, one arm around her waist, and she leaned back against his solid chest, watching the town fall away below them. When they reached the cabin, Isaiah dismounted and helped Grace down, but before she could take a step toward the door, he scooped her up in his arms. "What are you doing?" Grace laughed. "Carrying you across the threshold," Isaiah said. "I know we are not married yet, but I wanted to do it anyway." "Is that all right?" "More than all right," Grace said, her heart full to bursting. Isaiah carried her inside and set her down gently, and for the first time, Grace looked at the cabin and saw not just shelter but home. Her home. Their home. "When do you want to get married?" Isaiah asked, suddenly nervous. "Dr. Hendricks mentioned the Reverend. We could go back down in a few weeks, do it properly if you want. Or we could do it sooner," Grace suggested. "I do not need a big ceremony, Isaiah. I just need you, but I would like to be your wife properly and officially." "How much sooner?" "As soon as possible," Isaiah grinned, a rare full smile that transformed his face. "I will ask Running Elk," he said. "He is Ute. He knows the old ways of marriage. If you do not mind doing it his way, we could be married by the end of the week." "I do not mind at all," Grace said. Running Elk came 3 days later, a man in his 60s with weathered skin and sharp black eyes that seemed to see everything. He regarded Grace with open curiosity, speaking to Isaiah in a mixture of English and what Grace assumed was Ute. Finally, he nodded. "She has a strong spirit," he said to Grace in careful English. "And you survived the cold mountain. That is a good test. You will do well here." The ceremony Running Elk performed was simple but beautiful. He spoke of the earth and sky, of two spirits choosing to walk the same path, of the strength found in unity. He bound their hands together with a strip of leather and told them to speak their promises to each other. Isaiah went first, his voice steady despite the emotion Grace could see in his eyes. "I promise to provide for you, to protect you, to value your voice and your choices. I promise to work with you to build a life worth living, here in these mountains or wherever we choose to go. I promise to love you, Grace, from this day until my last day." Grace felt tears on her cheeks as she responded. "I promise to stand beside you, to build this life with you, to face whatever comes together. I promise to trust you, to challenge you when needed, to support you always. I promise to love you, Isaiah, with everything I am and everything I will be." Running Elk smiled and cut the leather binding their hands. "Good," he said. "You are married now, by the laws of the people who lived here first and the laws of the heart which are older still. Be happy together." He stayed for dinner, telling stories of his youth, of Isaiah as a young man learning the mountains, of the changes he had seen in his long life. When he left, he pressed a leather pouch into Grace's hands. "Medicine herbs," he said. "For when babies come, you will need them." Grace blushed but thanked him, and Isaiah walked him out to where his pony waited. When he returned, he found Grace standing in the middle of the cabin, looking uncertain. "What is wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," Grace said quickly. We are married now, and I have never." Understanding dawned on Isaiah's face, and he moved to her slowly, giving her time to adjust. "Neither have I," he admitted. "We will figure it out together like everything else, if you want to wait." "I do not want to wait," Grace said. "I am just nervous." "So am I," Isaiah said, and somehow that helped, knowing they were both stepping into unknown territory. He took her hands in his. "We go slow. We stop if you want to stop. We talk. Deal, deal." What followed was tender and awkward and sweet. Two people learning each other in the most intimate way, making mistakes and laughing and trying again. Isaiah was patient and careful, and Grace was brave and open, and by the time they lay tangled together in the bed, both were certain they had made the right choice. "I love you," Grace whispered into the darkness, her head on Isaiah's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you too," Isaiah rumbled back, his hand stroking her hair. "More than I thought I could love anyone." They fell asleep like that, warm and safe and together, while outside the mountain wind sang through the pines and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The seasons turned, as seasons do in the mountains. Winter held on with fierce determination, dumping snow until the drifts were taller than Grace's head. Isaiah taught her to snowshoe, to ice fish in the frozen streams, to appreciate the stark beauty of the frozen landscape. Grace taught him to enjoy longer evenings by the fire, to see the value in reading aloud to each other from the books she ordered from Georgetown, to find joy in small comforts. Spring came slowly, the snow melting to reveal new green growth, wildflowers bursting into color across the meadows. Grace planted a garden near the cabin, vegetables and herbs to supplement their diet. Isaiah built her a chicken coop and surprised her with 6 hens from a farmer near Georgetown. The chickens provided eggs and entertainment, and Grace named each one, much to Isaiah's amusement. They made the trip down to Georgetown once a month, delivering furs Isaiah had trapped and treated, buying supplies, visiting Martha, who had settled happily with her sister. On one of these trips, Isaiah took Grace to visit the Reverend, and they were married again, this time with a certificate that made it official in the eyes of the law. Summer brought warm days and cool nights, the mountains alive with birdsong and the rush of snowmelt in the streams. Isaiah took Grace on longer trips into the high country, showing her hidden valleys where elk grazed and eagles nested. They swam in cold mountain lakes and made love under the stars, and Grace thought she had never been happier. It was in late summer that Grace realized she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable, and when she told Isaiah, he stared at her in wonder for a long moment before sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around, laughing like she had never heard him laugh before. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Grace asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Isaiah said. "Terrified, yes, but so happy, Grace, so incredibly happy." They prepared through fall and into winter, Isaiah making a cradle from smooth pine, Grace sewing tiny clothes from soft fabric. Martha came to stay as Grace's time drew near, arriving with her sister Elizabeth, both women ready to help with the birth. Isaiah paced like a caged bear while Grace labored, only allowed in the room for brief moments before Martha shooed him out again. When the baby finally came, red-faced and squalling, Isaiah was called in to meet his son. He stared down at the tiny creature in Grace's arms, this impossible combination of him and her, and wept openly. "He is perfect," Isaiah said, touching one finger to the baby's tiny hand, marveling when the little fist closed around it. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Thomas," Grace said softly, "after my father." "Thomas Parrish," Isaiah said, testing it. "I like it. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world, son." Thomas grew strong and healthy, thriving in the mountain air. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and both parents were utterly devoted to him. Isaiah proved to be a natural father, patient and playful, singing his off-key songs and making the baby laugh. Grace watched them together and fell in love with her husband all over again. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, tiny and fierce and loud. They named her Catherine after Isaiah's mother. Where Thomas was cautious and thoughtful, Catherine was bold and adventurous from the start. She kept them on their toes, climbing everything, exploring everywhere, fearless in the way only the young can be. The cabin grew more crowded and more joyful. Isaiah built an addition, adding 2 more rooms and a proper loft. The children grew, learning to walk and talk and help with daily chores. Thomas loved the animals, gentle with the chickens and Thor's eventual replacement, a mare named Honey. Catherine loved the wild places, begging her father to take her into the mountains, coming back with pockets full of interesting rocks and feathers. Grace and Isaiah grew together too, their love deepening with each passing season, each shared challenge and triumph. They had arguments, of course, disagreements about how to handle situations or what was best for the children. But they learned to talk through problems, to respect each other's perspectives, to find compromises that honored both their needs. When Thomas was 6 and Catherine 4, Martha and Elizabeth came for a visit, bringing news that Martha was courting the town's widowed blacksmith, a good man who made her laugh. Grace hugged her friend tightly, thrilled that Martha was finding happiness of her own. "Look at us," Martha said, watching the children play in the clearing outside the cabin. "We survived that terrible day and look what we built from it. You have your family, I have mine. Life is strange, is it not? Strange and wonderful," Grace agreed. Years continued to pass, marked by growth and change. Thomas grew tall like his father, interested in books and learning as well as mountain skills. Catherine grew wild and strong, happiest when she was climbing trees or riding Honey. Isaiah's hair gained more gray, and Grace found laugh lines appearing around her eyes. They wore these signs of aging with pride, evidence of a life well lived. When Thomas was 12, he asked if he could go to school in Georgetown during the winter months, staying with Martha and her now husband Frank, learning more than Grace and Isaiah could teach him at home. It was a hard decision, but they agreed, wanting to give their son every opportunity. He came home every few weeks and all summer, and his joy at being home reminded them they had made the right choice. Catherine never wanted schooling beyond what her parents taught her. She was meant for the mountains. Everyone could see it. She learned tracking from her father, plant identification from her mother, and became known in Georgetown as the girl who could outshoot, outtrack, and outride most grown men. Isaiah worried about her sometimes, about whether she would find her place in the world, but Grace always told him not to fret. "She is like you," Grace would say. "She knows who she is. She will find her way." And Catherine did, eventually meeting a young man named James who worked as a surveyor for the railroad, mapping the mountains. He was one of the few men not intimidated by her skills, and Catherine liked that about him. When she was 19, she married him in a ceremony at the cabin, with family and friends from Georgetown making the journey up the mountain to celebrate. Thomas, meanwhile, became a teacher in Georgetown, eventually taking over the small schoolhouse and teaching children of miners and townspeople. He married a quiet girl named Sarah who loved books as much as he did, and they had 3 children of their own who called Isaiah and Grace Grandma and Grandpa, and loved visiting the mountain cabin. Catherine and James built their own cabin on land Isaiah helped them claim, just 2 miles from the original homestead. They had 2 daughters who were as wild as their mother, and Grace loved having them nearby, loved watching her grandchildren grow and learn the mountains just as her children had. Isaiah and Grace grew old together, their bodies showing the wear of hard mountain living but their spirits remaining strong. They added on to the cabin again over the years, built a better barn, improved the garden. They became fixtures in Georgetown, known and respected, the couple who had started from tragedy and built something beautiful. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the cabin for a celebration. It was summer, the mountains green and gold, wildflowers blooming everywhere. Someone had brought a guitar, and there was music and dancing in the clearing where Grace had once taught her children to read and Isaiah had taught them to throw knives. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Isaiah took Grace's hand and led her away from the crowd, up to a spot on the ridge where they had a clear view of the valley below and the mountains stretching endlessly beyond. "You remember the day we met?" Isaiah asked, his arm around her waist. "Of course," Grace said. "You gave me your boots." "And carried you," Isaiah added. "I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, even half frozen and terrified." "I thought you were terrifying," Grace admitted. "This huge man appearing out of nowhere. But then you were so gentle. You saved my life, Isaiah." "We saved each other," Isaiah corrected. "You gave me a reason to be more than just a man in the mountains. You gave me a family, a purpose, a life worth living." Grace leaned into him, comfortable in the circle of his arms after all these years. "No regrets?" she asked. "Not a single one," Isaiah said firmly. Not one," Grace agreed. "I would do it all again exactly the same way, every moment that led me to you, every choice that brought us here." They stood together in the fading light, watching the stars begin to appear overhead, listening to the sounds of their family's laughter drifting up from the cabin below. Two people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and built a life that exceeded anything either could have imagined. "I love you," Isaiah said, the words as true now as they had been the first time he spoke them. "I love you too," Grace replied and kissed him, sweet and familiar and home. Below them, the party continued, their children and grandchildren celebrating the love story that had started with bare feet in the snow and a mountain man's kindness. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, bearing witness to the promise made and kept, to the life built together, to the love that had endured through 25 years and would endure for all the years yet to come. Isaiah and Grace returned to the party hand in hand, ready to dance and laugh and celebrate with the family they had created together. And as the music played and the fire burned bright against the mountain darkness, everyone there knew they were witnessing something rare and precious, a love story that had begun with a simple act of kindness and grown into something that would echo through generations. The children they had raised would tell their children about the day their grandfather gave their grandmother his boots, about how he carried her through the snow to safety, about how love could bloom even in the harshest conditions if tended with care and commitment. Those grandchildren would tell their own children someday, the story becoming family legend, a reminder that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected places. But for now, in this moment, there was only music and laughter and joy. There was only a mountain man and the woman he loved, surrounded by the life they had built together in these wild mountains. There was only home, and it was more than enough. It was everything.